Hello everyone, and welcome to Train Talk. Many different locomotives have been built for railroads over the years, so, to the untrained eye, they can often be difficult to tell apart. I have decided for this video to talk about different types of freight locomotives and some distinguishing visual characteristics to tell them apart. This is actually going to be part one of what will most likely be a multiple-part series. In this video, I'll give you a brief introduction to the different series of locomotives that have been built over the years by the two major freight locomotive manufacturers, General Motors' Electromotive division, now owned by Caterpillar as Electromotive Diesel, and General Electric. We will look at some common visual characteristics of the different series of locomotives and what makes them different from other series. I will also briefly mention some of the more common models. To keep this video straightforward and relatively easy to follow, I'm not going to get into all of the technical specifications for each locomotive. Those will be saved for another time. Let's start off by looking at the different series of diesels built by Electromotive Division, or EMD for short, followed by several of the ones built by General Electric. We'll then finish off by comparing EMD and GE diesels, pointing out certain characteristics of each that will help you identify them from one another. Some particular details that we will be paying attention to in order to identify these locomotives are how many axles they have, their truck design, and what the locomotive cab shape and location is. Alright, let's begin. We'll start off our overview of EMD diesels with some of the smaller ones they built that were originally designed as yard switchers. These are SW and MP series locomotives. They are commonly referred to as end cabs because the locomotive cab is located at the end of the locomotive rather than at the front like most other diesel locomotives. In addition to having the unique feature of a cab at the end of the unit, these locomotives also feature two trucks, each with two axles. This is what's known as a B-B wheel configuration by the Association of American Railroads. In addition, the SW and MP series have a low roof line for the engine compartment, significantly lower than the level of the cab roof. This low engine compartment with a cab at the end of the frame is a signature design of just about all common switching locomotives. The horsepower output for locomotives in these series ranges from 600 to 1500 horsepower. SW and MP locomotives were, and in some cases still are, used for switching work in rail yards as well as shorter freight runs like locals and transfer runs moving cars between different rail yards. A few other series of EMD-built switchers were constructed, including the NW, NC, and SC series. The SW series was produced starting in the mid to late 1930s. Originally, the S in the designation stood for 600 horsepower and the W for welded frame, although later model SW locomotives were much more powerful. MP series locomotives first started to appear in the mid-1970s as a replacement to the SW 1500, the last of the SW series EMD built. Unlike older switchers, these locomotives were designed as road switchers, meaning that they could be used for either switching cars around in yards or pulling longer trains such as local freights. The designation of MP was for multi-purpose, emphasizing their ability to be used outside of railroad yards. While the older SW series of locomotives can be distinguished from the newer ones somewhat easily, it can be a little difficult to tell an SW 1500 from an MP 15. MP 15s are slightly longer, sit taller, and have a larger fuel tank, but unless you have an MP 15 and an SW 1500 next to each other, knowing which is a little tricky. One other way to tell the difference between the two is that MP 15s use the more current EMD Blomberg-style trucks that are standard on the larger 4-axle EMD locomotives. SW 1500s, on the other hand, used either switcher or flexicoil trucks. The next series of EMD locomotives is known as the GP or General Purpose series. Rail fans or enthusiasts often refer to these locomotives as Jeeps. Initially, the GP series was intended for general through freight service, hence the General Purpose name. Some railroads also use these locomotives on passenger trains. Today, they are mostly used as yard switchers and power for local freights, but they can occasionally be seen filling in on through freight trains from time to time. Like the MP and SW series, these locomotives all have a B-B wheel configuration, 2 trucks each with 2 axles. They also share the same Blomberg-style trucks used by the MP series. For the most part, the roofline of the engine compartment on a GP locomotive is pretty much even with the level of the cab. Radiators and other components on these locomotives vary from model to model, and since there are so many important locomotives in this series, I will save pointing out all the unique features of each of the different models for a future episode. In particular, the number and size of the radiator fans are often very helpful in telling different GP model locomotives apart from one another. Locomotives in the GP series range in power output from 1500 to as much as 3,800 horsepower. The model designation for these locomotives is usually quite simple, just the letters GP followed by the model number. In some cases, you will see a -2 following this number. This simply means that the locomotive is a slightly newer version of that model, usually just receiving a newer onboard electronic system than older models. Many older Jeeps have been upgraded to the -2 electronics and are now essentially the same as the newer -2 versions. Some railroads have further upgraded their locomotives with even newer electronics, giving these locomotives a -3 designation. Another important thing to look at with the GP locomotives is the cab and nose design. The older Jeeps had a high nose that was the same height as the locomotive cab, known as a high hood. One of the biggest complaints with these locomotives was that the crew had poor forward visibility. Many railroads would eventually switch to a low-nose version or even chop the noses of older high-hood locomotives to turn them into low-nose units. Starting around the 1960s, a standardized cab and nose style was adopted by EMD as the standard option for all of their road locomotives. As such, this became known as the EMD standard cab design. The other common nose and cab design is known as the wide cab. This design seems to be a little bit mislabeled because the cab itself really isn't wide at all. Rather, the term wide cab really just refers to the fact that the nose of the locomotive is wide, the same width as the cab to be precise. Wide cab GP locomotives were relatively rare in the United States, most being delivered to Canadian railroads. The one major exception to this was one of the last GP locomotives to be built, the GP60M. More than 60 of these units were built for the Santa Fe Railroad in the early 1990s, intended for express intermodal freight service across the desert Southwest. Another variation of the basic locomotive design was the B unit. These units were more common in the Streamliner era, but there were a few made later on as well. A B unit is a locomotive that does not have a controlling cab. These locomotives are placed in the middle of locomotive consists to give a train more power and are controlled, like other locomotives, by the leading locomotive. B units were not too common in the GP series, the only major example being the GP60B, purchased by the Santa Fe. Over 24 different GP series locomotives were built by EMD between 1949 and 1994. Of those, some of the most common are the GP7, GP9, GP30, GP35, GP38, GP40, GP50, and the GP60. The last of the EMD locomotive series that we will look at is known as the SD series, short for Special Duty. These locomotives share much in common with the GP series, the only major differences being that they are significantly longer and they ride on 2 3-axle trucks in the C-C wheel configuration instead of the 2-axle trucks the GPs use. SD locomotives were produced beginning in 1952, with the first model being the SD7. The SD series was intended for longer, heavier freight trains than its smaller GP series counterparts. Newer versions of this locomotive are still being used for pulling mainline freight trains, but many of the older models have either been sold off to smaller railroads or continue life as yard switchers or power for local freights. Horsepower for these locomotives ranges from just 1,500 in the SD7 to to the whopping 6,000 horsepower that was put out by the original SD90 Max before they were either scrapped or downgraded to 4300. Just like the GP series, some models feature a -2 at the end of the model designation, indicating a newer version of the locomotive with the upgraded -2 electronics. Cab and nose design for these locomotives roughly followed the same history as the GP series. However, in the 1990s, as production of the GP series began to draw to a close, newer SD series models continued to be produced, especially in the SD70 series. Some railroads, such as Norfolk Southern, continued to order some of these locomotives with the standard cab design, but by and large, over concerns and regulations regarding crew safety, the wide cab design became the new standard until the narrow nose standard cab design was eventually phased out altogether. Production of locomotives in this series is still ongoing, with the latest two models being the SD70 Ace and its modernized low-emission version known as the SD70 Ace-T4. Besides the SD70 series of locomotives, other common models include the SD9, SD40, SD45, SD50, and SD60. Now let's take a look at some of the General Electric locomotives that can be found on the main line today. A number of different locomotive series have been produced over the years by GE, so I'm going to try to mainly focus on the ones that can be seen currently in service on the major freight railroads in North America. The first GE locomotive we will discuss is the -8. -8 locomotives were first built in the 1980s, replacing the older -7 series and the GE U or Universal series. The -8, like nearly every GE locomotive built from the 1960s on, was designed as a road diesel, meaning that it was intended for mainline freight use. Today, many railroads have begun to retire their -8 locomotives, but they can still be seen running on most of the major freight railroads, as well as a passenger version known as the -832 BWH that was built for Amtrak. -8s were built as both standard cab narrow nose units and wide cab wide nose units. Additionally, the locomotives were also produced in both 4-axle and 6-axle versions. Horsepower for the -8s ranges anywhere from 3,200 horsepower to 4,400 horsepower. Now let's take a brief moment to talk about the locomotive model designations and compare them with EMD model numbers. Remember that EMD's basic designations are simple. Just a 2-letter prefix indicating the model series followed by a 1 or 2-digit model number. Some locomotives also have a -2 or a -3 designation at the end indicating upgraded locomotive electronics. General Electric model numbers are a little different. Their model designations have a 1 or 2-letter prefix. For older locomotives, this prefix typically indicates if the locomotive has 4 or 6 axles. The letter B is used for 4-axle units and C for 6-axle units. These letters come from the basic B-B and C-C diesel locomotive wheel arrangements. The prefix is followed by a 2-digit number indicating the horsepower of the locomotive in the hundreds. For example, 44 is short for 4,400 or 4,400 horsepower. Following the 2-digit horsepower number, there was a hyphen and then a single-digit number indicating what locomotive series it was. Sometimes the letter W follows this number, indicating that the locomotive has a wide cab. Let's now apply this to the -8 locomotive. One of the most common of the -8 models was the 6-axle 4,000 horsepower wide cab model. This locomotive was given the designation of C40-8W. Another very popular -8 model was a 4-axle version of this locomotive called the B40-8W. Another similar model that had 4 axles and 4,000 horsepower, but with a standard cab rather than a wide cab, was designated simply as the B40-8. Continuing on from the -8 series, GE began producing the -9 in 1993, with the first and by far the most common model being the C44-9W. This was the third and final locomotive series under the Dash name. Now, I have not yet been able to get final confirmation on this, but from what I have read, the Dash 9 refers to the fact that these locomotives were developed in the decade of the 1990s, much in the same way that the Dash 8 series was produced in the 1980s, and the older, now long retired Dash 7 series was produced in the 1970s. Dash 9 locomotives all had two 3-axle trucks in the C-C wheel configuration. All but a handful of locomotives that were produced for Norfolk Southern had the wide cab configuration. Most Dash 9s can deliver 4,400 horsepower with a small number of units rated for just 4,000. The key way to tell a Dash 9 from a Dash 8 is by looking at the locomotive trucks. The Dash 8s had a slightly more round-looking truck design, while the Dash 9s were more squared off. The Dash 9 series also gave rise to the AC Traction AC 4400 CW and the mighty 6,000 horsepower AC 6000 CW. These locomotives both look nearly identical to the Dash 9 as they were built on the same basic Dash 9 platform, but they both have a larger electrical cabinet with AC power inverters located directly behind the left side of the locomotive cab. The AC 6000 also has a larger radiator section at the rear of the locomotive. Production of locomotives in the Dash 9 series ended in 2004 when the model was replaced with GE's new Evolution series. The last locomotive series we will discuss is the General Electric Evolution series, often abbreviated as GEVO. These locomotives were developed in the mid-2000s to be lower polluting than the older GE models. Most locomotives in the series have 4,400 horsepower and all have 3-axle trucks. They look very similar to a Dash 9 or an AC 4400. The best way to tell them apart is the greatly enlarged radiator section in the back of the locomotives. The basic locomotive model designation for the GEVO is the ES44. ES for Evolution series, and 44 for 4,400 horsepower. GE has built AC and DC versions of these locomotives classified as ES44AC and ES44DC respectively. In addition to these original GEVOs, General Electric also makes an even lower emitting GEVO that complies with the Environmental Protection Agency's Tier 4 standards. These locomotives have even larger radiator sections. They are known as ET44s, the T indicating Tier 4 compliant. At this point in time, the General Electric GEVO is one of the most common locomotives you can see on the main line today. If you want to know more about the GEVO series and all the different locomotive models, check out episode 8 of Train Talk all about the GEVO. Well, that's pretty much it for the different freight locomotive series you can find on the major U.S. freight railroads today, but before we go, I want to take a moment to give you some pointers for identifying if a locomotive was built by EMD or GE. First, let's take a look at the trucks. Following the Dash 8 series, most General Electric built diesels used the standard high adhesion trucks. One easy way to spot these trucks is the presence of a large spring on either side of each wheel axle. On other GE and EMD locomotive trucks, these springs aren't nearly as visible, as in the case with the EMD SD Ace, where the truck's side frames largely obscure these springs. Another area to pay attention to is the cab. We'll focus on the newer wide cab locomotives because almost all of the locomotives with a narrow nose that are still operating are EMDs. First, let's look at the GE. Ever since the Dash 8 model, all General Electric locomotives have used the same basic wide cab and nose design. Note how there is a very small flat section of the nose roofline right above the headlight with an angle down on either side to the front corners of the nose. Going back to the cab windows, the roofline angles up again. Compare that with the EMD-built SD Ace, where there's a much wider, flat section above the nose headlight and door, and then a large chiseled-out section on each front corner of the nose where the sand filler hatches are located. From the nose corners, the roofline then once again is straight and flat all the way back to the cab windows. So just remember, if you see a wide cab locomotive with a nose that looks like this, you will always be looking at some sort of a GE. The last thing to pay attention to, particularly on newer locomotives, is the rear radiator section. Pretty much all modern mainline diesels have a very large flared radiator section. There really is no easy way to describe the differences, so here is a side-by-side comparison between a General Electric GEVO and the EMD SD70 Ace. If you want another way other than by looking at the locomotives to tell the difference between EMD and GE locomotives, another thing you can do is to listen to the sound of the engine working. There is a very distinct sound that is produced by both GE and EMD engine blocks, and if you listen carefully, you can start to hear the differences between the two. GEs have a very distinct chugging sound that they make, while EMD locomotives have more of a high whining noise. Here are a couple of samples. Well, that does it for this episode of Train Talk. As always, thanks for joining me. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to share with me, please leave those in the comment section below. If you aren't already subscribed, you're always welcome to do so, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on my latest videos and posts. For even more railroad-related content, check out my other social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Flickr. And remember, every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific Time, there's always a brand new railroading adventure headed your way right here on the YouTube channel. That's it for now. Until next time, I'm Mike Armstrong. I'll see you down the line. Thanks for watching.